Thank you, Heather and James. It was extraordinarily beautiful. Always the gift of music in this church is special. As Heather was singing, "You lift me up so I can walk on stormy seas," I was looking at the window that was made for this church, which shows a moment from the life of St. Christopher when he carries baby Jesus across the dark and deep waters. And in a way, it's an image of fatherhood, of surrogate fatherhood, of care and concern, high up on the shoulders, as the song lyric put. That window, in many ways, is a memorial to the founding minister of this church, Joseph Worcester, who was a surrogate dad to hundreds of orphan street children in the city. And one of the many things Worcester did was to establish children's homes for the poor and the destitute who had no parents. The accounts of Worcester's funeral are quite moving, at these grown men who were working class, weeping and weeping in sorrow at the passing of Worcester, because he had been such an important father figure in them. So maybe for some of you, we don't always have the easiest of relationships with our fathers on Father's Day. You can think of someone who was like a Worcester in your life today, who gave you mentorship, guidance, and lifted you above the troubled waters. Right. So today will be a little bit of an experiment, sermon style-wise. It'll be a mixture of my normal, more Devin Zuber mode of some thoughts with Juncho Lee's in the spirit, in the moment, channeling what comes to him, which is maybe appropriate for Pentecost, which is all about those tongues of flame and fire that come and descend down on heads. What do we do with this incredible story as moderns? How do we interpret this? Maybe it's less fantastic for us to believe in the instant translatability of all these languages being understood, when you can go anywhere in the world with your smartphone, press a button, and have somebody else's language converted into yours and have universal intelligibility. What does Pentecost mean linguistically? You know, I'm trained as a literary professor, so I'm always interested in the etymology of words. Where does that phrase Pentecost come from? Does anybody know?
50 days after Easter?
That's right. Literally, it's the 50 days after Easter. And in America, a lot of us have a less deeper connection with Pentecost as a tradition than many European and Orthodox forms of Christianity. I lived for many years in Germany, and there, Pentecost, Pfingsten, is still a big holiday, one of the biggest school holidays of the year. If you've spent time in England, this is Whitsun Sunday. Given our particular history of the separation of church and state, Pentecost is not a national holiday that we establish. Maybe it's kind of a weird part of the Christian tradition for you. When we think of Pentecost, we often think of glossolalia, this term we use for speaking in tongues. And although that's most associated with Pentecostal traditions today, this practice of feeling the Holy Spirit and being filled with a language that is seemingly incomprehensible, it's been part of Christianity since the very, very beginning. We can think of some familiar and friendly mystics we often like to cite in this church, not just Swedenborg, but Hildegard von Bingen, the German mystic. She spoke in tongues. Perhaps you can think of a time when you were in a context where you didn't understand the language or what was going on. Maybe that was abroad, maybe it was here at home, but when have you been in a place of intranslatability? Can anyone think of what the Pentecost story does within the biblical tradition, this magical moment of suddenly everything being able to be understood? When the writer of Acts wrote about this miraculous story, this moment of understanding is very deliberate. Where else in the Bible do we have a moment of language, leading to misunderstanding and falling apart. Babel, the Tower of Babel, excellent. And what happens in that story about the Tower of Babel? Languages are established, right. And people no longer understand one another because they were trying to build a tower up to God. Swedenborg, our mystic that our Christian church here comes out of in some ways, felt that story about the Tower of Babel was a symbol of the way church structures aspire to control and have domination over others. It came from a selfish love of oneself and a wish to use spiritual truths to control others. So rather than it being an actual story that happened, Swedenborg saw this as a metaphor for church structures. I'll just read a little bit from Swedenborg to give you a sense of flavor of what he meant by Babel. By Babel is meant the church consisting of those who use holy things to aspire to have dominion over the whole world, and by this means of dominion over the souls of men, claiming to themselves the singular power of saving whoever they will, and who at last seek and want to have dominion over all of heaven and hell. So we can think of Pentecost in a way as envisioning an undoing of the trauma of that moment of dominion and control we get from the story of the Tower of Babel. It sutures a gap. It brings back a comprehensibility. So my question for all of you is, if you can put yourself in the shoes of the Jews who hear this noise and they come to the room where the tongues of fire have been circulating, what do they hear in their own language? What is being said? What do you think was being said?
Spiritual truths.
Spiritual truths. Perhaps it was the gospel, the good news. And I think we could winnow that down, that spiritual truth of the gospel, to one key thing: the forgiveness of sins. When we read the gospels again and again, this good news is, you are not imprisoned by your past. Go and sin no more, as Jesus says to the woman caught in adultery. So, I think one practical question that comes out of Pentecost for us is, how would we translate that sense of freedom to others who are in different contexts, who speak languages other than our own? Whether that's a different work field or discipline or actual language. Can you meet that person, that friend, where they are and speak to them in their own language about this message of love and forgiveness? Swedenborg actually says very little about Pentecost, in part because, somewhat quirkily, he didn't give much attention to any of the epistles by Paul in the book of Acts. For him, it was all about the book of Revelations and the Gospels. He does have some anxiety about the way Pentecost was interpreted by Protestant traditions into this glossolalia, this speaking in tongues with great enthusiasm. This came out of his own formative experiences in London, where he was hanging out with the Quakers and the Moravians and other kinds of Christians that had ecstatic forms of liturgical practice. How is this relevant for us today? Whether it's Swedenborg in the 18th century or those early Christians in the room with this miracle of the tongues of fire. Well, maybe we can just pause and think about the volume that has been turned up in our contemporary culture, the loudness of dissent and anxiety and anguish over the current situation we find ourselves in. And you can interpret that in a lot of different ways, here at home in California, in the Bay Area, but also globally. Perhaps you, like me, have friends who live in Iran, in Tehran, or in the Holy Lands, and are facing calamity at a level that we haven't seen in decades. So there's a lot of words, a lot of noise, a lot of din, clamor for our attention happening in these troubled times. I won't take the time to read this long Swedenborg quote that's in the bulletin. I'm glad Ginger didn't read it, because it's very particularly geared towards preachers and the dangers of enthusiasm and calling on the speaking in tongues. So it's a warning. But what's useful in it, I think, is Swedenborg talking about the need to have a love for truth at the heart of what one says. That preaching should have a divine love for truth, like the sacred fire that flowed into the apostles, as Swedenborg puts it. So I think we need to be looking for the truth in words today. And I think things are going to get a lot tougher than they are right now. Perhaps you have been distressed like I have about the images coming out of Southern California, Los Angeles in particular, families torn apart, due process violated, in many cases, American citizens unlawfully detained in conditions that violate UN conventions on prisoners of war. People have been made to sleep on concrete floors for days at a time, defecating in buckets, nothing to sleep on other than a foil blanket. In some cases, this is happening to minors. These are nannies taken from parks, flower sellers, taco truck purveyors, people at car washes. A friend of mine attended a meeting 6 days ago here in San Francisco. It was a gathering of around 50 community activists. Present were local politicians, including Daniel Lurie, State Senator Scott Wiener. They wanted to meet with people who are involved in organizing to warn them what we see happening in Los Angeles is going to happen here. It's not a question of if, it's simply when. And this is coming soon. And they want people to be safe, to protect themselves as they exercise their rightful voice to dissent. So, what are we to do at this moment as Christians? How are we called to witness and show up? Amidst the clamor and confusion, the social media streams that are bite-sized, meme-based, clamoring for our attention, lots of noise, I think we might need more deliberate language that slows us down, that opens us to deeper reflection. So, amidst all the protesting, all the stuff that's outside this sanctuary happening in the world, I think we need more poetry. And I'm not just saying that as someone who also has a hat as a literature professor across the bay. Poetry can be grounding. We have the pure poetry of the Bible, which Ginger read beautifully today, in the Psalms, in Isaiah, in the prophets, a longing for justice, words that were written out of a place of oppression and injustice, and yet still a hope for a better world and God restoring peace. That's a word that appears again and again in the prophets and the Psalms. That's one place to go. And I would like to end my sermon reflection, my message with you, by sharing two poems that I have come back to. And I think one of them will be familiar because I've referenced it before in my messages. And they both come from Ireland. So a nod to Bet, our Irish congregant here. The first is by William Butler Yeats, who received the Nobel Prize in Literature. Yeats was a deep reader of Swedenborg and someone who felt the trauma of the First World War, the violence of trench warfare, and wondered, where is our world going? If this is a new age of Christianity unfolding, as Swedenborg suggests, what do we do with the dead, the violence of our time? What will the 20th century look like? It was also written under the unfolding Irish Civil War, where brothers were turning against brothers. It's called The Second Coming. I'm sure this is familiar to some of you, so I will hold these words in this space. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming? Hardly are these words out of my mouth when a vast image of the Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs while all about it are reeling the shadows of indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to a nightmare by a rocking cradle. What rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? It's a dark poem. It's been hard for me not to have it in mind as bombs are falling on Jerusalem and we see what happens when religion becomes aligned with state power and there's animosity and hatred. Maybe some of you know that poem more indirectly. It's been used by Chinua Achebe in Things Fall Apart, which got him the Nobel Prize. Closer to home, Joan Didion, the great essayist, with her essays about San Francisco, titled it Slouching Towards Bethlehem. So it has a long resonance. Yeats ends that poem with a question, what is the future going to look like? This rough beast slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. Where are we going? Will the new century be one of continued horrors and war, or something else? Something else is possible. I think this is what Christian hope should give us. Another world is possible. And my final poem I want to leave you with is one by Seamus Heaney, The Cure at Troy. Heaney was not a reader of Swedenborg, but someone who was in deep dialogue with Yeats and that earlier poem about war and violence in the Second Coming. And I wanted to share this with you because it comes from a very personal place. In 2001, I was newly married. I was teaching at a community college in Manhattan as part of my grad program that was 2 blocks north of what became Ground Zero. And I watched those 2 towers collapse into flames from my rooftop in Astoria, Queens, losing family members who worked on the 99th floor for Fitzgerald and Cantor. My grandmother sent me this poem by Seamus Heaney in the months that followed. And as some of you know, my grandmother was very influential and important for me in my journey with Swedenborg and literature. And I want to share it with you now. Perhaps it's new for some of you. It was a favorite of President Joe Biden, who even cited it in one of his early addresses after his first inauguration. So here's Seamus Heaney, and this is written out of Heaney's response to the troubles of Northern Ireland, the ongoing aftermath of the Irish Civil War. Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and they get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Call miracle self-healing, the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. For if there's fire on the mountain, and lightning and storm, and God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its term. It means once in a lifetime that justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. So friends, my wish for you is to find those spaces where you can reflect in language against the din and clamor that is outside these beautiful sanctuary walls, and look for the ways that you can help hope and history rhyme. Amen.